My name is Dr. Terry Leyva-Reese. I have the great honor and privilege of serving as the interim president here at GCC. I want to thank you for being here and thank you for taking time out of your very busy day and your evening to come and continue with your education outside of the classroom by listening to a phenomenal speaker. We had the pleasure of having dinner with him this evening and was enthralled by what he had to say and his perspective on things. I know you're going to learn so much. A big shout out and thank you to our diversity committee who was able to bring this together for you. We have Dr. John Pagan here, Dina Desai, Dr. R.J. Leemaster,
Paul G. Davis.
Davis?
Paul G. Davis.
Paul G. Davis, one of our adjunct instructors. It takes a lot of effort and focus for individuals to work outside the classroom on things that benefit our students and our college. And the Diversity Committee represents that for me. They represent bringing amazing speakers to our campus so that you have an opportunity to learn outside the classroom and continue your education. So thank you for being here. And let me turn it over to Dr. Leemaster.
All right, thank you, President Ruiz. It's with great pleasure tonight that I introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Eduardo Pagan. Dr. Pagan was born and raised in the Phoenix area and started his academic career in the district at Mesa Community College. He then received a BA from ASU, an MA from the University of Arizona, and an MA and PhD from Princeton University, all in history. He is currently Associate Dean of Community Engagement in the new College of Interdisciplinary Arts and Sciences at ASU West. He is the author of over 10 peer-reviewed journal articles, 10 book reviews and scholarly publications, and has given dozens of invited lectures. His book, Murder at the Sleepy Lagoon, Zoot Suits, Race, and Riot in Wartime LA, was published in 2002 and he is currently working on 3 additional projects. Valley of the Guns under consideration with the University of California Press, Sound the War Cry, the battles over Navajo participation in Arizona politics, and Puerto Rican nationalism. Before returning to ASU, Dr. Pagan served as an assistant dean of students at Princeton, a faculty member at Williams College, a college that is consistently ranked among the best in the nation, and a senior program officer at the National Endowment for the Humanities in Washington, D.C. While at ASU, he has served as chair of the Department of Language, Cultures, and History, co-chair of Ethnic Studies, and as president of the West Campus Faculty Senate. He has held an NEH fellowship and was a postdoctoral fellow at Wesleyan University and at the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Pagan was also a co-host of the History Detectives on PBS and has worked previously with the award-winning PBS series American Experience as the lead historical consultant for the television episode and website entitled Zoot Suit Riot, based in part on his aforementioned book. He has served as a panelist for the Department of Education, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Arizona Humanities Council, and he has served as a committee member for the Organization of American Historians. He's done some stuff, as you can tell. Today, Dr. Pagan will be giving a lecture entitled The 21st Century and the Problem of the Color Line. I think I speak for everyone here when I say that we are looking forward to learn from an expert like Dr. Pagan on this important and timely topic. Following the address, you will have an opportunity to engage with Dr. Pagan, so if you have questions as you're listening to him speak, I encourage you to write those down and then present the questions at the end of the lecture where we will have time for a discussion. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Eduardo Pagan to GCC.
All right, give me just a second. I want to use this microphone here. All right, test. Okay, good. It's working. Thank you for coming out tonight. And Dr. Leemaster, Dr. Leyva, thank you so much for your introductions. Here's what I thought I would like to do tonight as we spend some time together. I want to talk a little bit about the issue of race, the question of race in the United States, particularly as we think about the 21st century. I've been inspired by recent events to think a little bit more about this, although this has been a topic of much of my scholarship as well. The different ways in which we as Americans, in fact, all humans have been racialized in one way or another in our history of humankind. I've thought these issues through, and I want to kind of share some ideas with you, some thoughts as well as we kind of think about race. Now, The title of tonight's presentation, The 21st Century, The Problem of the Color Line, is actually inspired. Let's see if I can get that to work. Hold on. Oh, it was working earlier. Let me try it one more time.
It's working on here, but not up there. So.
Oh, that's interesting. All right. So there's a disconnect between the camera. Let me continue talking a little bit. Hopefully we get this to work out. So the question, the theme about the problem of the color line is inspired by one academic, one scholar that I am terribly inspired by myself, W.E.B. Du Bois, who in my mind is easily one of the greatest intellectuals that we have produced in the United States of the 20th century. In 1903, he published a book called The Souls of Black Folk, which continues to be an important text when it comes to studying race. So the camera is...
I think it'll work now.
Okay, let me give that a try. Hang on a second. So he was actually, the reason why I'm talking about Du Bois, oh, thank you very much. All right, thanks for your magic. Was in The Souls of Black Folk all the way back in 1903, at the turn of the century. He wrote this observation that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And I wish you were around to ask this question, whether this was an optimistic statement or not, that by the time the 21st century rolled around, there would be no problem with the color line. I want to spend a little time kind of reflecting upon the persisting and enduring questions and issues of race that we have with us as Americans as we move forward in the 21st century. And so my thoughts are really inspired by Du Bois and his seminal work as well. So here's some basic research questions that ground my presentation tonight as I've thought about some things that I want to share with you. To begin with, as we think about race and the different ways in which race works, why are some people racialized and others not? Even those within the same group. I'll explain that a little bit more with question number 3, but let's look at number 2 then. Why are some racialized in specific moments of time when they are not in other moments? In other words, there's this persistent belief that you are indelibly, whatever color is assigned to you or whatever color you're assigned to yourself. And I want to suggest to you that actually that's not true. That there are different moments in which you can be racialized in a positive way or racialized in a negative way, and it changes. It changes almost moment by moment. What allows that to happen? And then question number 3, what allows people to compartmentalize race? Have you ever had this experience when somebody said, oh, we didn't mean you, you're not one of them, right? Has anyone ever had that happen? Okay. What allows that to happen? Now, I am a native of Arizona, as Dr. Lee Master had mentioned. I've grown up in the valley. I always like to say on the wrong side of the canal, in the shadow of Sun Devil Stadium. And growing up in Arizona, it was a very interesting time growing up in the 1960s and 1970s. For me, growing up as a child in this period, racial epithets, words which I would never say in public now, were common discourse. Very common. In fact, there's a poem, there's a nursery poem that probably all school children say, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger, right? That's interesting that people of this generation would say tiger. I grew up with a different term. And of course, growing up, this is just what you hear neighborhood kids saying. It was a different term. It was a pejorative term as well. Again, one that I would not repeat today. But why was this all just normal, right? Why was this normal? Well, the point that I want to make here is that there are moments when you study race and how race works in the United States, there are moments when some people are racialized and others are not. Even though you might be in the same group, some people might consider you not one of them, right? You're different. What allows that to happen? So, let us begin with some basic questions then. What is color when we talk about racial color? What do we mean by that? And what is race when we use these racial terms? Now, again, growing up in the United States, you're all familiar with common racial food groups as I characterize them, right? Black, white, Latino, Indian, Asian. There may be a few others as well. But I mean, we all grew up with these kinds of categories. I want to suggest to you that race is a narrative of power. It is a narrative of power. What I mean by narrative It is a way of constructing ideas and a way of speaking that revolve around relations to power. That's what I mean by race. I don't want to suggest to you that this is how race works in the United States. Yes, we always talk in terms of phenotype, hair color, eye color, skin color, right? When in fact, your color, your presentation, however you appear, may not matter at all in a given context, and it may matter greatly in another context. Same individual, same day, same hour, but depending on the moment. We were just joking as we were driving over here, as I was chatting with Professor Lee Master on this. Just to give an example, so we're driving up from La Santísima, was that the restaurant? Had a great dinner there, by the way, highly recommend it if you haven't been there. So we're driving up to campus, and we're talking about this, and to give an example, I suggested to Professor Lee Master that we had a great dinner, and we were all colleagues, we were all professionals, we were all PhDs, all doctors, sharing a dinner, had a great time, great discussion. Whoever and however we identify as racialized individuals mattered not at all. Nobody asked, nobody cared. Right? However, as we were driving up to GCC, I gave the example that if Sheriff Arpaio decided to do a sweep of that intersection at that moment, suddenly my color would be highly significant at that moment, and probably his wouldn't, right? And so that's an example of how from moment to moment, color may not matter in the slightest. And in other moments, it may matter tremendously. One last example that I shared with Professor Lee Master as well. And it just doesn't work in terms of pigmentation. It works in any way that people are racialized. If you think about, there are many pockets of the United States where there is generational poverty. Generational poverty, grinding poverty, the kind of poverty I will never experience, I've never experienced. And those people are white as can be. In other words, their skin color matters not at all, has absolutely no impact on their lack of access to opportunity, to decent jobs, to decent wages, to decent education. Has no impact whatsoever. And so their skin color, even though they may be white, matters not the slightest. So here's what I'm trying to suggest. Is in the United States, as we talk about race, we often talk as if these colors are indelible. They will never change no matter where you go, and I want to suggest that's not true. I want to suggest that race, when we talk about race, this is really a narrative. It's a construction, and it's based upon relations to power. Now, I want to suggest this as an opening supposition to my presentation tonight. Racial constructions are narratives created in time and place to explain and justify relationships to power. Those narratives are fictive in nature. They're creations. They're fictive in nature, but they are non-fictive in application. So in other words, even though we talk about race, there are words that we use, terms that we use all the time when we talk about race. Those are fictive categories. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by that in just a moment. But the ways that they work in society, there's real application, real consequences to that, right? If you're racialized in particular ways, right? So, let's begin with this. Let me define some terms. And as I define some terms, this is just to make sure that we're all on the same page and you understand what I'm thinking about when I invoke these terms. I want to define some terms, and as we go along, you'll begin to see and understand what I mean by this suggestion that race is really a narrative of power. That's really what it is. And it's not based solely upon color. Color itself is a fictive creation. It's based on a number of things, a number of complicated social phenomena that come together. So we'll start off in terms of terminology. Race is color, then I'll define what I mean by race, ethnicity, invention, and finally racialization. Again, this is just to make sure that we're all in the same color. So let's start off with the notion of race as color. The ways in which we commonly speak about race, right? We invoke these color categories all the time. This is the color black. Right there. That is the color black. This, which you can barely see, is the color white. No human being alive is that color or that color. And yet, we use these terms all the time to describe human beings. So what do we mean? What are we talking about when we invoke this color which has no application whatsoever to human beings, what do we mean when we invoke that color or the other color? And it goes on. Even the notion of Latino is itself is based upon a fictional idea of Latin America. So I want to suggest, I'll say that again, because we've all grown up thinking about Latin America as Latin America, right? Latin America itself is a fictional construct. Here's what I mean. If you have a chance to look this one up, here's the reference right here by Michel Gobain, The Invention of Latin America. There was a philosopher, he was an engineer by training, he was a philosopher in France, early 19th century, by the name of Michel Chevalier. And as he envisioned and thought about Europe, he envisioned a Latin Europe in contest with Teutonic Europe. Now, there's no reality to this, but again, this is part of his thinking, his philosophy, that the Latin races, quote unquote, were in some contest against the Teutonic races of Europe as well. Now, this was during the age of the early 19th century where they talked about these things all the time. They talked about the Teutonic races and the Anglo-Saxon races and the Latin races and so forth and so on. But he argued that the southern continent of the Americas was inhabited by people of a Latin race, and they were then natural allies with Latin Europe. And this idea really caught hold with a lot of intellectuals of what we now call Latin America, South America. It caught hold because this was a time when there were many of the South American, Central and South American republics who were newly independent from Spain and rejected looking to Spain for any kind of cultural or intellectual guidance. And they really looked to France instead. And so this idea about Latin America caught on. But here's the problem. Nobody south of our border speaks Latin. It's the language of the Roman Empire, right? I don't know about you, but me, with deep roots to Arizona, and even before I was like this, my grandfather always liked to boast it, that even before the Spaniards came, we were here, part of my family at least. They don't speak Latin. So why does this term Latin America have any kind of identity? And so the term Latino comes based on this idea of Latin America, which is itself is a fictive construction, right? You understand what I'm trying to say? Is that this was a term that had resonance in the 19th century for political reasons that caught on, and we continue to use this term today, Latin America. But again, there's nothing Latin, there's nothing Roman about Latin America, what we call is Latin America. So all of these ideas, all of these categories are fictive constructions. Now, there are political realities to them, yes, but there's very little more than that. Now, if humans are not the colors, white or black or any of the other colors you want to describe them, what do we mean by invoking the term of race? What do we mean by this? Now, as a historian, I always like to look at the history of where ideas came from. I'm an amateur etymologist at that. And so we look at the etymology, the origin of the word race, and it comes from the old Italian term razza, which simply means lineage or descent. That's all it means. It didn't mean anything more than that. It's just what was your ancestry. Now, it's used in a very different way than as it was intended in old Italian. In an idiomatic or popular usage, people can talk about the German race or the Anglo-Saxon race, right? It's usually one definition is when we invoke the term race, it's a group of people united or classified together on the basis of some perceived common history or nationality or geographic distribution. So certainly as you read literature in the 19th century, early 20th century, you can find discussions about the German race and the Anglo-Saxon race and even the French race and so forth, the Russian race. Now, today when we evoke the term, as I've been talking about, today in the 21st century, here in the United States, we largely use race as a description of skin tone, color, and I would suggest cultural traits. I want to pause and just let that one sit for just a moment. Yes, skin color, we talk about that all the time. But I would say also cultural traits. Have you ever heard somebody say, oh, you're acting white? What do we mean by that? Really, think about that. What do we mean by that? And of course, there's the opposite charge as well as, oh, you're acting black. What do we really mean by that when we talk about certain characteristics, certain behaviors, attitudes, cultural traits that we identify or we ascribe to these colors? So again, what I want to suggest is that the way that we, in the 21st century and 20th century as well, as we use race as, yes, it's a description of skin tone, but also behaviors, culture. Right? Now, where do these ideas about race come from to begin with? Let me take you back very quickly. If you go back to the ancient world of the Greeks, classical Greece, whenever the Greeks talked about the world, they divided it between the Greeks and the barbarians. That was the dividing line for them. And barbaros in Greek, barbaros simply meant people who spoke some alien tongue. In other words, they weren't intelligent enough to speak Greek, and so they're barbarians. And that's where we get the term barbarians, from this term of, that's how it sounded to Greeks, right? That's how they got this term barbaros, right? That's all it meant. And that's, in the Greek world, that's how they divided the line between us and them. You're either Greek speaking or you're some strange people out there who don't know how to speak Greek. You go forward into the Roman times. The Romans divided the world between the civilized and the savage. And what they meant by that was in the Roman world, in Latin, civis and civitas made reference to how you lived, whether you lived in cities or whether you lived out in the woods, in rural areas. If you lived out in the rural areas, this was called silvaticus, savage. It's the origin of the word savage. And so in the Roman world, it wasn't so much linguistic, the divide between us and them. It was more about your habits of living. Did you live in cities or did you live out in the woods somewhere, out in the boonies? They never spoke in terms of color. They acknowledged color, surely. They acknowledged different colors of hair, different colors of skin. But that's not where social relations revolved around in the Roman world. It revolved around your lifestyle. Now, in the age of discovery, what we call the age of discovery, as European commercial expansion went out to Africa, to Asia, Europeans were introduced to differences in religion and phenotype as well. And those differences of religion and color and appearance, they factored into this process, this evolving process of racialization, as we talked about it. Now, you move forward in time, history of race as concept, in the age of enlightenment, as scientists began to explore the natural world and assign scientific classifications to the natural world, they would then look for the species and the genus and all those other categories about plants or animals. Well, eventually they turned their attention to humans as well and tried to characterize human beings in the same way that they would characterize lemurs or porcupine or bears or something else, or flowers, you know. They characterized human beings. And so if you look at, it's interesting, if you look at European anthropologists of the 17th and 18th century, you look at their various racial classifications, they usually revolved around skin color, hair type, body proportions, and yes, even skull measurements, phrenology as it was known. And by and large, if you look at these ancient studies of the human race, they usually came up with categories that most people no longer invoke. Categories such as Caucasian, Mongoloid, Negroid. Some of these taxonomic systems also included Australioid. Some of them were even more finely tuned than that. But these were kind of the major racial categories that were used in the 17th and 18th century in scientific studies of race. This was the precursor of our modern usage of these different races as color: white, black, Asian, Latino, American Indian, so forth. These were the precursors of that, even though we don't use these terms. Those old terms are rarely used, as I said before. At most, if anyone in the United States uses the term Caucasian, I'm not so sure that it's used that much anymore, but it's almost always used exclusively to mean white or European ethnicity, right? Today, race is popularly used to describe observable physical features and cultural characteristics, as I suggested before. Here's one last thing I want to introduce to you as well, as we're talking about these racial terms. Scholars tend to try to be much more careful in using these terms, because scholars recognize that the groups defined by racial categories, they seldom coincide neatly with definitions put forward by earlier anthropologists. So in other words, any group of people that were confined to the Australioid population, the Mongoloid population, there's no hard and fast line of what is them and what is not them. It's a very fuzzy line. In fact, some people would argue that there's no line whatsoever. So here's an example. The African category, or the black category, there's no global definition of what black is. You can be in other parts of the country and be defined as not black, but come to the United States and be defined as black, or vice versa, right? And so a lot of this has to do with the political and historical realities of the country that you live in. And because of this, and the study of human genetics, scholars and scientists now consider race to be a social construct rather than an objective biological fact. Now I appreciate that I guess popular thinking today, there's still this idea that there is an observable and appreciable difference, genetically speaking, between the so-called races, when in fact that is not true. There's only one race, and it's the human race, and that's it. Even though, politically speaking and socially speaking, we still invoke these categories as if there was some reality to the different racial groups. And in fact, I would argue that there is some historical reality to it, just in the way it's used. Let me complicate this and show you what I mean. So to begin with, the term Caucasian comes from the Caucasus Mountains. This map, if you could make this out, this is the part of the globe that we're looking at. So here we are. This is Spain, this is Italy, Greece is over here, Turkey's over here. These are the Caucasian Mountains right here, the Caucasus Mountains, right over here. This is the Middle East, this is the upper Middle East. So wait a minute, think about it. Now, if Caucasian means white, why is this term from this part of the world being used to describe people from this part of the world? Again, I share this with you just to illustrate the fictive nature of these categories. There's nothing hard and fixed by them. They have their certain realities. Now here's a game I usually play with my class. This is a picture of ethnic Caucasians. They're straight from the Caucasus Mountains. Find the white guy. If you look in the middle, this is a picture of George W. Bush. Now, there is President Bush. Now, the reason why I put it that way, again, is in the United States, if you ask somebody, well, what does Caucasian mean? They would say white. Notice these ethnic Caucasians. They're pretty dark complected. Not terribly dark, but they are dark complected, dark people. But interestingly enough, he's the one who's classified as Caucasian in the United States. They might be classified as ethnic, something else, I'm not sure. But again, I hope you understand, you see what I'm trying to illustrate is, again, the fictive nature of these categories and how they are very, very, very fuzzy. So, let's talk a little bit about the term ethnicity. So now that I've problematized the notion of race, let's talk about ethnicity. The way that we use the term ethnicity is often used to describe a cultural difference within a so-called racial group. So this is a picture of Luis Gonzalez. Some of you may not remember, but he used to play here in the Valley and finished up his career with the Dodgers. Now, if one were to ask Gonzalez what his race is, he would probably answer white. Now, I say probably because I never asked him directly, so I'm not sure, but I'm guessing he would answer white. If one were to ask his ethnicity, he might answer Cuban. So, that's an example of ethnicity. Here's another one as well. Joe Montana, quarterback for the San Francisco Giants as well, won several Super Bowls. Same situation, Montana, Italian descent. If someone were to ask Joe, what is your race? He'd probably say white. If they asked him his ethnicity, he'd probably say Italian as well. So I want to suggest to you, let's come back to the idea of race as an invention, that scholars recognize that so-called racial categories are historically contextual. It depends on time and place when these terms have meaning. They are socially unstable, and they are malleable. They change over time. These racial categories change over time. Here's an example of what I mean. I want to take a close look at this statement by Benjamin Franklin in 1751. Let's read this one together, because this illustrates my point. Benjamin Franklin, 1751, he's looking out the window, and he's looking at all these immigrants coming across, and he says this: the number of purely white people in the world is proportionately very small. In Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. The Saxons only except, and let me pause here, make sure you understand what he's saying. He said Saxony is a part of Germany, and so he's saying that region alone is the only one that is not swarthy. Who, with the English, I could wish their numbers were increased. Perhaps I'm partial to the complexion of my country. So I want you to get what he's saying here. These are white people in the mind of Benjamin Franklin. It's basically Anglo-Saxons and Saxons. That's it. Everybody else is not white. Everybody else is something else. Everybody else is darkened. Note who he mentions who are not white. Spaniards, Italians, French, Russian, Swedes, and most Germans. And he would probably include Austrians as well. Now today, in 2016, they're all considered white. But in his day, they weren't. They were something else. He doesn't include the Irish, but trust me, the Irish in this period were not considered white. Didn't matter how blue their eyes were, how many freckles they had, you see them? They were not considered white. So this is what illustrates the point. So let's take a look at this very quickly. I just want to flash a few pictures up of various people of these representative countries. Here's Queen Sofia and King Juan Carlos, together with Laura Bush and President George Bush. You know, if I were to come down from Mars and meet these four people, I couldn't tell them apart. I could say, oh, that was Spanish, that was American. They look the same. Same hair color, same skin tone, right? But according to Benjamin Franklin, they weren't white. Here's another. This is Spain. This is Prince Felipe and his wife Leticia, who was not royal blood. That's why she's simply called Leticia as well. Here in the United States, if you saw this couple walking down the street, you probably wouldn't think anything of it. No, there's a handsome white couple there. But according to Benjamin Franklin, 751, these people aren't white. They are not white. Okay? This is from Italy. This is Cristina Chiavotto. She was Miss Italy 2004, if I remember correctly. She's a popular television figure today. Maurizio Cacciatore as well, popular professional volleyball player. Again, according to Benjamin Franklin, these people aren't white. If you saw these two women walking down the street here in the United States, you wouldn't think anything of it. You wouldn't think, oh, they're a couple of Italians right there. They just blend in with everybody else. France, Francois Hollande, Marine Le Pen as well. Russian, Boris Yeltsin, Vladimir Putin, blonde hair, blue eye, right there. But again, according to Benjamin Franklin's view, these people are not white. Sweden, ABBA, let me just say, this is when music was good. And Eva Nordegren, some of you may know her as the former wife of Tiger Woods as well. Again, so according to Benjamin Franklin, not white. These are swarthy people. These are not white people, and these are not the people he wants coming to the United States. So I share this with you again to illustrate the idea that the notion of whiteness has changed over time, and it has grown tremendously. If you went back in time, you can get into a TARDIS and go back in time. Yeah, and you would land in the United States 250 years ago. What they thought of white was a very, very narrow category, and everybody else was not white, right? So last one, Germany and Austria. Here's Angela Merkel, Germany, and the governor from Austria, but living in California these days, I believe. All right, so another term that I want to talk a little bit. I've mentioned this term before. I want to make sure that you understand what I mean. Racialization. So race is a social construction or convention of identity, often for economic and political purposes. Okay? Racialization is the process by which a group of people are made the other, often involving the imposition of a seemingly indelible and inherited identity. For example, for much of British history, the Irish were racialized as inferior people. Now again, I want to point out, if you've never been to the UK, if you came down from Mars and you have no exposure to world history at all, and you looked at an Englishman and you looked at an Irishman, they would look the same to you. I mean, there's just no difference whatsoever. But for much of British history, the British racialized the Irish as non-white, in fact, subhuman. I'll show you some pictures very quickly. But here, I just want to share this with you. Which is interesting is to study the history of the English colonization of Ireland, which was then a prelude to the English colonization of the United States. Very, very interesting, similar dynamics that took place. I just want to say very quickly, for about a 500-year period, England worked very hard, often with bloody results, to subjugate the Irish. That's what you need to know from this slide as well. During that 500-year process, the Irish were racialized as subhuman. They were characterized as wild, as savage, and dangerous. Now here's why I'm telling you this. This image of the other as violent and untrustworthy and a threat to society is an image that has been used in the racialization process to justify power relations. And you need to understand this. Now, this picture, in my mind, speaks volumes. This was drawn by Thomas Nast, who was who was the one who popularized Santa Claus and Uncle Sam. Okay? Here's a picture that represents Ireland to the left and England to the right. So a couple of things I want to explore this picture to begin with. So notice the rock in the hand, so he is a physical threat. Notice the woman and the way she's standing. She's perfectly upright. Shoulders squared, spine straight and erect as well. Nice, clean features, right? And she's standing with her sword. She's a representative of civilization. Now the Irishman, hunched over, like almost in a Cro-Magnon fashion. Notice the large jaw. Notice the flat nose as well. So what I want you to understand is how the Irish were conceptualized as subhuman. They look Cro-Magnon in their drawings as a way of supporting the narrative of who the Irish were. Even though, again, if you went back in time during the period of these kinds of hostilities, you couldn't tell anyone from another. They all look the same. In fact, there's a lot of similarities. Both England and Ireland were Christian, they were agricultural, they were semi-literate, they both had primitive textiles and metallurgy, they both had commerce with other countries. The major differences between England and Ireland were political and cultural. Those are the major differences. But the rhetoric of conquest cast that struggle to conquer Ireland in moral terms. And so if you read the rhetoric of the English colonization from their side, it's cast within these terms of we have a God-given right to spread civilization and to conquer these savage people because of the threat, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all part of the narrative construction of race. It's an example of how other white people were racialized as non-white. Okay? And these realities exist in the United States. For a good part of our history, up until the 19th century, in fact, I was trying to, certainly up until the 19th century, if you go into the colonial period, many of our indentured servants that came across were Irish as well. So this is an example. Now, I want to continue forward though, remember this image here of the Irish as subhuman, right? This kind of like hulking Cro-Magnon kind of figure. As I suggested before, there's a long history of creating the other as subhuman. Here is a drawing of an American Indian. Notice the stooped over shoulder. Notice the exaggerated jaw and the nose as well, right? All suggesting something less than fully human. Go forward in time. This is a picture, this is a poster from World War I. This represents Germany, other white people, but nonetheless, notice how they are treated as subhuman, as a threat to civilization. What's rather interesting is the white woman has long been a symbol of civilization and has long been invoked in our narratives about the reason why we must go to war. We must protect white women from the threat of whatever that population was. So even though Germany is a European nation, today would be considered white, in this poster, in this narrative construction justifying going to war, they are made to look like a menacing animal, and there is civilization which must be protected. Fast forward, this blurry pictures from World War II. Notice how the Japanese are also represented in a very similar manner. Very broad jaw, flat nose, menacing feet, with his hand on the mouth of a white woman, right? So my point is that these images of subhumanizing others is all part of the narrative. It's all part of the discourse to justify power relations, right? And there's a long, long history of people doing this. It's not just Americans. I mean, this is something you can find in many other parts of the world as well. So here are 2 points. I want to make sure you understand. There are social and cultural differences that are racialized as part of the narrative of justifying power relations. And there are ideas and perceptions about race and about what constitutes racial groups that change over time. All right, so remember Benjamin Franklin's statement about the so-called white race and how what we consider white in 2016 is so different than what it was in 1751. So these ideas about race, they change over the time. They are not fixed in stone. They're not indelible. They change all the time. That realization, I believe, is very important to understand that these racial categories change over time. Not only do they change over time, they change from moment to moment. I would argue that. We'll look at that. So here's what I like to do with my class when we're talking about race. So I want a few people just throw out some ideas. I'm going to flash up some pictures. You'll probably recognize some of these folks. Some of them are celebrities. And I have for you categories: white, Latino, black, Asian, other. So, someone just shout out, name that race. What would you say? White? So I hear white. Anyone else? Latino? Okay. Anyone else? What's that? Jewish. So I guess he would be other than, right? Yeah, he is. This is Jerry Seinfeld, of course, so he's Jewish as well. Now, I throw that up there as a little bit of a trick. Jews were racialized in ways very similar to the Irish. In the sense, in fact, I was just sharing this at dinners. We were talking about this at Princeton, my alma mater, for my doctorate. Up until the 1950s, there was a quota on the number of Jews that they would allow into Princeton. I believe that the number was 50 per class. And beyond that, there weren't any more Jews allowed in. So there were restrictions against Jews, and even though today nobody cares what Jerry Seinfeld is, nobody holds that against him, but if you went back in time, his Jewish identity would matter quite a bit. So let's, right here, someone shout out, what do you think? White, Latina, black, Asian, Indian, other? Okay, Latina, anyone else? Does anyone recognize her? Do you? Okay, who is she? No, but that's a good guess. This is Rudy Batkiar. She was an anchor on CNN up until about 5 years ago. She's actually Iranian. She's born in Iran and grew up in the United States. So, and an example that you can't look at someone and say, oh, I know exactly who they are, right? Another example. White, Latino, black, Asian, Indian, other? What do you think? White? I hear white. Anyone else? Latina? Anyone else? Now, this is not a racial category. This is a national category. She's Israeli. This is Barb Raffaelli, former girlfriend of, I'm trying to blank now. He dates everybody. Oh, I'm trying to blank now. What's his name? Oh, Leonardo DiCaprio. Right? Yeah, okay. All right. Yes, so she is Jewish. She was Israeli. All right, so again, you cannot judge by simply looking at her who she is or what she is. What do you think? Latino, someone is saying? What else? Did I hear Asian? Asian, okay. Anyone else? Does anyone recognize him? Superman? Dean Cain, yes, when Superman was this is going back quite a ways, but yes, when Superman was, this is Dean Cain, and I think he's actually from mixed ancestry, but I think there is some Hawaiian in his background as well, is it? Half Japanese is what it is, but okay, I thought he was a mix or something, but again, my point is, you can't tell. You really can't tell unless he comes out and tells you. Now, what do you think? White, black, Latina, what? Other Latino? Mix? Anyone else? Now, do you know who she is? Sophia Loren? Oh, no, Sophia Vergara, no. Good guess, but no. This is Catherine Zeta-Jones. She's Welsh. Welsh from England. And yet, to look at her again, you can't tell. In fact, most people would think, oh, she's Latina. No, she is Welsh. They are of Celtic origin. What do you think? White, Latina, black, Asian, Indian, other? Let's hear her. Latina, do you know who she is? Yeah, I thought so. So who is she? No, she didn't die, did she? Does anyone know who she is?
Raquel Welch.
Raquel Welch, that's right. She's still living, isn't she? I hope so. Anyway. So, now, here's another picture. What do you think? White? Latina, black, Asian, Indian, other? What do you think? Okay. Now, why do you say she's black? The way she looks. Notice there is not much difference in coloring. Hold on a second. My battery just went. Hopefully this works now. Notice, there's a reason why I put these together. In coloring, there's really not that much difference. There's not that much difference between the two of them. She is black. She is not. Hair color is very similar. Skin tone very similar. Fullness of lips very similar. Fullness of nose very similar. You see my point? Right? In other words, there's no hard and fast line that says, cross this line, now you're something else. it's a very fuzzy and blurry line as well. Let's go on. What do you think? Yeah, come on, you guys know who he is, right? Yes, okay, so what do you think? Does anyone know? Anyone guess?
He is half black and half Jewish.
Actually, I didn't remember about the Jewish part, but I know it's
His mom is the lady from the Jeffersons, the neighbor. Yeah.
I'll check you on that one, but yes, his mother's African American. I do remember this. This is Slash, Guns N' Roses. What do you think? White, Latino, Black, Asian, Indian, other. Latina, did someone say? She is technically white because she's an Italian actress. I threw that there on purpose. Now, I want you to go back. Skin color, very little difference. Hair texture, very little difference. Full lips, very little difference. So why is one black and why is one not? See? This is, now, here's another. White, Latina, Black, Asian, Indian, other? Guess? Does anyone recognize her? Mexican pop star, Paulina Rubio? What do you think? Now, come on, she's all over the news. You must know who this is. I see a lot of blank looks. You don't know who she is. All right, so tell me, what is she? First of all, white, Latina, Black, Asian, Indian, other? Okay, someone says white? Mix? Mix what? White and black. Yes. This is Meghan Markle, who's dating Prince William. No. Prince Henry. Prince Harry, right? Harry, yeah. Half African American. But again, to look at her, I mean, you cannot tell. Here's my point, is that you can't tell with so many of these categories. They come from many different nationalities. The human race is really a mixed race. And so again, all of these are just to reinforce this idea that these categories that we use as if there are fixed realities are not fixed realities. They are changeable all the time. This is Xuxa, probably too old for many people here. She's from Brazil. What do you think? yeah, that's a trick one. Okay. Now here's one that I like to do as well. When we talk about these categories of race, one of these men here is an American Indian. The son of a very prominent American Indian activist. So you say the very last one on which side? Over this side? Okay. So we have a vote for this gentleman over here. Anyone else want to name or find the Indian? Yes?
The one on the far right.
Far right, okay. All right, anyone else? Blue shirt? All right. Now, I had a lot of fun with this. I taught a graduate course on the Gila River Indian Reservation, so we did the same exercise with them. It was very interesting to hear them and to watch them scrutinize, like, oh, no, it can't be. It's actually my friend Phil Deloria right here, is a professor at the University of Colorado, right here in the middle. He is the son of Vine Deloria. Custer died for your sins, if you are familiar with the literature of the American Indian movement as well. But what's interesting, though, is when you flash these images up, this man here who's dressed, you notice he's wearing a boot, poor man, sprained his ankle. But dressed in what we would consider traditional garb, standing next to his son who's dressed like every other college student, polo shirt, baseball hat. Take this right down here. Most people would look and go, oh, there's the Indian. Him you might look at and make other assumptions. Here's my point, here's why I'm flashing this up. It's their clothing that is part of this complicated mix when we racialize people. So clothing has a factor in it, behavior has a factor in it as well. These individuals here, you see somebody with a headband, you might think, oh, they're American Indian as well. They are, it's far more complicated. These are undocumented workers who are waiting to be deported to Mexico. And here's the last slide I want to share with you as well, yes or no. And again, this is a slightly different conversation, but in Mexico, 1/3 of the population does not speak the dominant European language. 1/3 of the population still speaks their native tongue. So I want you to think about what American society would look like if 1 out of every 3 could not speak English, but could only speak their native tongue. Giving an idea of the composition, it's estimated that 60% of Mexicans are of mixed native and European ancestry. 10%, 9 to 10% are of European, and all the rest are native Indian. So these undocumented workers that we have coming across, many of them are native Indians. They are Mexican Indians, but they're native Indians as well. So suddenly this becomes a different matter when you place nationality on top of it. Even though they are racially and ethnically Indian, you call them Mexican and they're deported. But it's a different matter when you look at it from an ethnographic perspective. All right, so here's the last thing I want to share with you. When we're talking about ethnicity, I want to just introduce you to a scholar by the name of Werner Sollers, who wrote this book, The Invention of Ethnicity. And I want to share this with you because of this. He argued that this idea that we have of ethnicity is invented. No matter what you believe your ethnic identity to be, it is invented. In the sense is that it was developed at a particular time and place. The narrative around what makes you Italian, Scottish, Irish, the list goes on, it is defined by history and by context, and it changes over time. These ideas, these concepts, these practices, they coalesce around certain groups, they anchor the identity, and they have the illusion of some sense of permanency, some myth of essentialism, that there's something authentic to this Scottish experience that unless you're Scottish, you will never understand. Those are all myths. Those are all narratives, right? And the reason why is because everything changes over time. I'll give you a very quick example. Sollers talks about this in his book. If you read about the history of the American West, you're familiar with the concept of the Chinese laundry, right? Chinese laundry. This is a staple in many Western cities, that the Chinese ran laundry. Why did the Chinese run laundry? There is nothing about owning a laundry that is intrinsically Chinese. You go to China and you won't find a laundry every other shop. You understand? There's nothing intrinsically Chinese about owning a laundry, and yet this is part of how Americans think about Chinese in the 19th century, that they own laundries. Now, there's a reason why many of them own laundries, and there are economic reasons. But in itself, there's nothing intrinsically Chinese about owning a laundry. Here's another example. The Scots and the tartan plaids. And there's this idea, you can just go online and just Google tartan plaids, and you will find websites devoted to these various patterns that go back for generations and millennia, all the way back to the dawn of time when the Scots ran around with the tartan plaids. The problem with that is that we know that tartan plaids didn't come about till about the 1600s. Part of that, they didn't wear tartan plaids. And yet, if you ever saw the movie Braveheart, based on the life of William Wallace, you notice the tartan plaid that he's wearing and all of his soldiers are wearing, it's historically anachronistic. It is not true. They didn't wear tartan plaids back then. But the ways in which the Irish and the Scottish talk about what makes them who they are is the whole notion about the tartan plaid, as if it's something that existed for time immemorial, handed down by the finger of God, so to speak, right? And in fact, it's not true. Tartan plaids did not originate with the Scots. They simply adopted it at a certain point in their history and kind of rewrote it into their past. All people do that. I'm not trying to out the Scots. All people do that. Whatever your ethnic or racial category is, it changes over time. That's what I'm trying to get across. It changes over time. Here's my point. Racial constructions are a complex mixture of ideas about power and subservience, propriety and impropriety. Again, now let me just pause right there. As I asked you before, have you ever heard the term, you're acting white or you're acting black? What are the implications behind those charges, right? It revolves around what is proper and what is improper. Around security and insecurity. These constructions are also curiously malleable. They change. And they can change from moment to moment depending on the social discourse. These ideas about race, they change over time. And then color is not always synonymous with racial identity or social position. Say that again. Color is not always synonymous with racial identity or social position. So, why do these distinctions matter? That race is a malleable idea. It's an elastic idea. It changes. I want to suggest first that narratives are powerful instruments. The stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, powerful, powerful instruments. They shape how you think about yourself, and they shape how you think about each other. But they are narratives. You need to understand that. And because they are narratives, they are unstable and they can be changed. They can be changed. The narratives about who you are can be changed. That's what I want you to understand. These narratives, however you self-identify, however other people identify you as a racial category, it's a narrative, and a narrative can be changed. The implications for understanding racism. Racism, I want to suggest this. Racism is not a reaction to color per se, but what color represents. So you think about all of the issues that we're wrestling with now in 2016, we'll probably wrestle with them as we go forward in time. God willing that we will overcome them in our lifetime. But nonetheless, we still have some work to do. You think about all of the racial injustices that we're seeing. I want to suggest that color, this racism is not a reaction to color per se, but to what color represents. It's part of the narrative, right? So, closing thoughts. So I want to return to this notion of the English narrative of the Irish as wild and violent and untrustworthy and subhuman. Note how the body is used to convey the ideas of what is civilized and what is savage, right? Civilized is standing up straight, square shoulders. Savage is hulking over like this, right? Notice the ways in which the body is used. I bring this up because one of the books that Professor Lee Master mentioned that I wrote about was Murderous Lagoon. Just to make a long story very short, part of what I looked at was the popularity of jazz culture in the 1940s. Now, most of you are too young to remember when hip-hop first hit the airways, mainstream airways. But when it did, people went crazy. Oh, they thought the world was coming to an end. The youth these days are going to hell in a handbasket. I mean, there was a lot of this discussion. Same reaction back in the 1950s when rock and roll hit the mainstream airwaves. You know, when Elvis was dancing on television. You know, oh my gosh, what is happening to kids today, right? Jazz had the same evocative power in the 1940s. And one of the things that I want to share with you, even though it's kind of funny, I mean, you know, my grandparents danced the swing, you know? But back in the day in the 1940s, it was highly scandalous. When you understand it in context, this is what proper young people did when they were socializing. This is how they behaved, this is how they dressed. This is how they moved their bodies and held their bodies. If you've ever done ballroom dancing, the waltz, to begin with, hold your back up straight, shoulders squared, you hold your partner out like this. Right? So there's actually space between you and your partner. And then you move like this. Right? So you hold the upper body straight. Swing dancing comes along. And this is a form of dance that is popular among young people that are race mixing, and notice how they're dancing. They're down low, and they're throwing each other. They're throwing the girls up in the air, skirts flipping up, I mean, you get that sense of motion, right? And they're swinging and they're moving, and it's not this proper way of holding the body. So I share this with you as a way of just suggesting that when we talk about racial categories, when we talk about the narrative of race, again, it's more than just color. It involves these notions of what is proper and what is improper. How you hold your body or not hold your body, right? All of these are part of the narrative that I want to share with you as well. So this is the last two slides I want to share with you. I realize this is provocative to you, but I want to leave you with this thought. Picture of Dr. Ben Carson, who I understand as of today is being considered for the Secretary of Education in the Trump administration. Here's the question I want to ask you. You all know that Breitbart was a part of the Trump campaign, the alt-right movement, right? What's interesting, if you go to Breitbart.com and do a search in the search engine for Dr. Ben Carson, you will not find one negative portrayal of Ben Carson. Not one. Not one negative comment whatsoever. In fact, if I were blind and I was reading all the commentary that you'll find on Breitbart.com about Ben Carson, I would have no idea what color it is. Absolutely not. So the question is, what allows this individual who has been racialized and can be racialized, what allows him access to power within this context? So that people, what's that?
It's education.
Part of it, that's all part of the discourse. Again, what I'm trying to share is that it's a very, very complicated mix when we talk about race. It's so much more than just color. Last slide I want to share with you. Omarosa, right? Was also part of the Trump campaign. The same question we can ask about her. In what ways does her political alignment allow her to traverse these arenas of power that are so fraught with very, very complicated ideas and issues as well? So I leave this slide, these last two slides with you as a way of illustrating the complexity of color and race in the United States. And if you remember anything, I hope it's just these two ideas. One is that whatever your identity is, whatever your color is, however you self-identify, it is not fixed and stable in time, but can change depending upon a narrative about you. So the question is, what is the narrative you want to be about you? It can change. The second thing is that these racial categories are fictive, they are creative, and because they're fictive and creative, they can be changed as well. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that we can change it tonight because we all decide to use a different terminology. But I do believe that there's enough evidence in the study of American history and society that there are lots of examples of moments where people who are otherwise racialized can enjoy access to power in very interesting and curious ways. And I just shared with you two examples that we see with us now. Even though the discourse about the Trump administration is that it is far to the right, we're going to see a repression of rights and so forth and so on. We might, but again, we see these two individuals who seem to defy it. And the question is how and why? What gives them access to that power? So I leave that with you to contemplate. If you have any questions, I'm happy to attempt an answer. I can't say that I'll answer everything, but I'm happy to attempt an answer. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for coming here today. Do you want folks to use the microphone, or do you think we're...
Yeah, whatever you're comfortable with. If you want to stand up, I can run the microphone to you, or if you want to walk up here, or if you just want to raise your hand and shout out, whatever works.
Or if you have to go, I perfectly understand as well, so don't feel bad about it. Yes?
Now, you said in the slideshow with that woman, that the Italian woman, that she was labeled
Yes.
as white,
Yeah.
not as Latin, right?
Yeah.
Now, who defines Italians, quote unquote, as white? Is it the Italians themselves?
Yeah.
Or the people around them?
Yeah.
Because Latin culture started in Italy.
Yeah, so it's a very good question. So he was referring then to that slide that I had of the Italian actress, who was very dark, and he's asking who defines them as white. Now here's an example of how these ideas are not fixed in time and place, but they change depending on time context. So here in the United States, you're too young to remember this, but in Bensonhurst, back in the 1990s when there was a racial violence, I think it was the 1990s in Bensonhurst. Bensonhurst, New York, a suburb of New York City. There's racial violence that flared between the whites, quote unquote, and African Americans in that neighborhood. As it turned out, they weren't white in the way that you might think about it. They were actually Italian Americans living there. But here in the United States, that category of whiteness had changed so much that nobody cares whether anyone's Italian or not. They're just white. So I'm using that term white, her being white, within an American context. But I would also say that in Italy, having spent some time there myself, I think they would agree with that characterization. They would agree with them being characterized as white as well. So it's both from an American perspective that we look at Italians as white, but I think Italians, a lot of them would also characterize themselves as white as well. But white as in European, right? Even though I'm sure you well know that not all Europeans are blonde-haired, blue-eyed. Some are very, very dark, like me. So, yeah. Good question. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, would they characterize her as white if she were darker?
You know, that's an interesting question, and she might. And again, I would say much of it depended upon the context of who she is. Sometimes, like I would say often, economics plays a role in your racialization. Often it does. It's not an absolute, but it often plays a role in your racialization. So the poorer you are, the more you can be racialized. The more wealthy you are, the less. So I was, again, sharing with Professor Lee Master as we were chatting over dinner. I'm sure you all know the border stops over when you drive out to San Diego, right? On I-8. I can't tell you how many times I've driven out there. I have never been pulled over. And every time I brace myself and I'm ready to pull the mayor pull over. Why? Because I dress like an upper class American. I almost guarantee you that. Now, one of these days I'll pull over and say, hey, why don't you pull me over? I might ask. But you know what I'm saying? And a lot of it has to do with my presentation. if I dressed differently, and perhaps drove a different car, not a foreign one, but a different car, I drive a Volvo, again, they might, so a lot of it has to do with context. So, definitely do that. Other than, yeah.
Why did you choose to say Indian instead of Native American?
Oh, that's a very good question. So why instead of Native American? So Dr. Lee Master mentioned that I spent some time working at the National Endowment for Humanities, and part of my portfolio was to work with tribal colleges. There are 32 tribal colleges in the United States. I traveled to most of them, not all of them. And one of the things that struck me, I can't say that I've been to every reservation in the United States, but I've been to a lot. The one term that I heard the most was Indian. I never heard of Native American. I never heard American Indian. I heard Indian from natives themselves. And I would have this conversation, well, what do you prefer? In my perception, in my experience, for many of the communities that I visited, I can't say all, but for those that I visited, the term Native American to them is kind of like saying Negro to African Americans. It's such a dated term. Again, for many of the people that I've worked with on the reservation. So I just use a term that I've heard them use most often, and I've asked them, what do you prefer? American Indian, First Nation, Native American, Indian is one that they've simply embraced. So I use it for that reason. But thank you for asking. Actually, when I do teach a course on the history of American Indians, and I take some time to explain my terminology and why I use that term, which I didn't do tonight. So thank you for asking that. Yes?
Okay, honestly, when I heard your name, I actually expected you to have an accent when you speak, But while I was speaking, I was like, whoa, this is not what I was expecting. But anyways, my question was, why is it that education plays like a major role when it comes to racism?
To racial identities and racism as well. Let me say two things. First of all, English is not my birth language. I was born to speak. I was raised, I wasn't born, but I grew up in a Spanish-speaking home. But like many of my generation, and this was before bilingual education was in the schools, my mother, having been scarred by her experience in Catholic schools, being punished for having an accent, when we became of age to go to school, she made sure that we learned how to speak English fluently so that we wouldn't be punished in the way that she was punished when she was growing up. Now, times have changed, and people today in some parts of the country still, they learn bilingual education, but I grew up in that time where it was a tool that was taught to me, was to be fluent in English, again, to help me in my advancement that she wanted. So I'm not a native-born English speaker. I still struggle with the language, by the way. So the other question is, why does education have a role? I would say this. Again, my experience growing up as a blue-collar, non-white in Arizona, one of my learning curves that I had to negotiate coming to college, coming to ASU, was learning how to operate in an environment, to me, that was middle class and white. To me, that's how it seemed. It seemed like their world, not my world. It wasn't the neighborhood I grew up in. The dynamics were different. I had to learn to be culturally fluent in academia. And learning how to be culturally fluent allowed me then to be culturally fluent in other places of power that I've been allowed into. So to answer your question, I believe that education helps you to become culturally fluent. It doesn't mean you forget who you are. It's like learning another language. When you learn another language, you don't forget your birth language, or you don't forget the other languages you know. You simply learn another language. Culture's the same way. You learn how to become culturally fluent. And I would argue that that's part of what education teaches you. These values, think about in class. What do we want you to do? We want you to be able to stand on your feet and articulate your views with some passion and some intelligence. To me, that's a very middle-class idea, right? That's not the way that I was raised. I was raised to say, yes, teacher, whatever you want. This was one of the values that I grew up with, but I had to learn how to do things differently. And so, to answer your question, I think that's part of what education does. It teaches you cultural fluency within an arena of power, because education is an arena of power. So I would argue, if you can master this, you can master a lot. It would give you access to other arenas of power. So good question, thank you. Oh, yes?
What do you know about Standing Rock?
What do I know about Standing Rock? I can't say that I know a lot, other than I know that it's going on right now, that I know it's a very complicated issue as well. One of the problems, one of the downsides of being an academic is you learn to see both sides of the problem. So I don't know if I can answer any question that you might have, but I do know a little bit about it.
Well, I don't, just what is the issue? I'm not sure, because I was hearing the morality.
Yeah. So this is, help me out, colleagues. Standing Rock, this is the pipeline issue, if I remember correctly. So the issue is whether a pipeline is going to be going across native territory that is considered sacred to some people, some of our native people as well. And so, part of what the United States, the government has exercised in many occasions the right of eminent domain. So in other words, they have the right to claim any parcel of land, compensate whoever might live there according to market prices, and then own the land. They have the right to claim it back, right? Well, it becomes a much more complicated place or issue when this is either native land, historically native land, or land of cultural significance. And so we have a similar situation here in Arizona, again, where there is the idea, the hope of mining on certain land just north of us that is culturally important to many of the native peoples of Arizona. And the question is, does the government have the right to exercise eminent domain? Do private owners have the right to purchase that land? Do the native communities have the right to lay hold of that land and say you cannot touch it? Very, very complicated issue, but that's in a nutshell, that's what we're looking at. Okay, if that's given you enough to think about. Oh, one more question. All right.
Professor, you stated at the end of your talk this kind of a jab to the Trump election by saying, well, civil rights might take a turn backwards. I think that's kind of disingenuous in a way as to claim that somehow a large portion of American society who voted for Trump or for Hillary somehow must be these closet racists or this white backlash or trying to speak, trying to get back at what they see as the election of Barack Obama or the rising of what they feel is minority rights, etc. Don't you feel, sir, with your, at the beginning you mentioned that Du Bois' comment that saying that race is the quintessential problem in the 21st century. But would you say, sir, with the advancements that we have made throughout the decades and the histories, and even in times that Du Bois was living in, with men like Booker T. Washington, who was born as a slave and yet rose to such great accomplishments, that we have transcended to a great point this issue, and have, by most, I would say, pretty mostly have overcome this problem.
Thank you for that question. Thank you for giving me a chance to clarify. There was a lot of concern on the part of many, I couldn't say all Americans, but certainly many Americans, about what this means then to have President Trump, who did not disavow any association with the alt-right movement. In fact, brought Steve Bannon on as a fundamental part of his campaign. What does this mean going forward? There's a lot of fear about what this means. I couldn't predict what's going to happen. I'm simply reflecting that the concern is out there. I'd like to believe, and I hope that you're right, that we have made many advances that will continue to go forward in time. I hope that's going to be the case as well, but it is also true that there are many people that are concerned that that is not true, that we might see a scaling back. I don't have a crystal ball. I can't say, other than to acknowledge that there are many people who are concerned about that. I will say one thing to your point, though, and I do agree with your fundamental premise that we have improved over time. I do agree with that. And the reason why I say that is that if you go back as recent as 1943, 1944, I'm trying to remember now when the executive order was given, I think it was 1944, no, I'm sorry, 1940, it was 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The reaction was that this was the work of enemy aliens within, therefore we must round up all Japanese citizens, and even those who were born in the United States of Japanese ancestry, we must return them. Well, you fast forward with 9/11, and there was no such similar reaction from Muslims after 9/11. I like to look at that and say we've improved as a country, and we've learned from our mistakes as well. So I'm hopeful that as we go forward, we will continue to improve this experiment in democracy, and that we will continue to live up to the fullness of our Constitution. I'm hopeful, but I have to acknowledge that there are people who are concerned at the same time. So thank you for that question.
Also, if you don't mind me asking one more question, and this is just your opinion.
In the beginning, James Baldwin said the question that the only thing that the black man needs in America, or wishes, or something along those lines, is power. What is your opinion on the Black Lives Matter movement, which is it's hard to define just because there's so many different people and members and with all these different affiliations, some of them socialists, some of them communist, or just people who are active in civil rights, etc. What is their real goal? Are they seeking power for their community, or do you not understand it, or what is your opinion of it?
Well, I would say a little bit of all of those options that you offered as well. I couldn't speak for the movement to begin with. From my perspective, my observation of what is happening is that the movement continues to evolve as we move forward in time, so I couldn't say definitively they're about this and this and this. At the essence of what they are about is to argue that their lives matter and that it is a protest against perceived injustices in law enforcement, which I find difficult to argue against. I think there's a lot of evidence. In fact, I think from all sociological studies that we've looked at that try to factor out as many variables as possible, there are differences in race when it comes to the enforcement of laws, but also the imposition of penalties for those laws as well. So again, also, in fact, I'm not aware of any study to the contrary. I believe all studies that I'm aware of do acknowledge that we do have injustices in the judicial system and the law enforcement system as well. And so, in essence, the part that I do understand from Black Lives Matter is that that should not happen. And that I agree with as well. And I think all Americans would agree with that. But as far as the other issues that I said before, it is evolving, so I couldn't say beyond that what they're about. They continue to change like any other organization over time, so it'll remain to be seen how things develop as we go forward. So, thank you for that. One last question, and then did I see a hand back here, or? Yeah.
Okay, my question is about the slides with Dr. Ben Casio. Okay, I see people complaining about Trump appointees, which is the white nationalist. Okay, during the campaign, everybody said different things, which of course it was people said provocative things against other people, and Dr. Ben Carson himself said something that was not right when it comes to Islam. I think he described it like maybe I think something like dog or whatsoever, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, let's flip the point of it. If Trump had appointed Dr. Ben Carson to that position that this guy is holding, what would going to be the reaction from other people, black, white, or those people that are protesting today?
I'm not familiar with the comment that's being ascribed to him. But if I understand your question,
yeah.
Are you talking about?
Dr. Ben Carson, he made a statement on national TV in one of the interview with I think CNN. He made a statement describing a Muslim, calling him a name that was not appropriate. Now, and he part of the Trump team. Yeah. If we flip the coin and Trump had appointed Dr. Ben Carson to this position that he appointed the white nationalist, what was going to be the reaction of people today?
No, it's a very good question. So in other words, Steve Bannon is now the chief, that's not chief of staff, no, it's chief strategist. I don't know. I couldn't. That's a very good question. I can't predict what the reaction would be if Ben Carson were then appointed to that position. I don't know. Yeah, good question, but I couldn't answer.
Yeah, and one more question. I want to really know, we as a people in America today, are we trying to abolish racism, or we promoting racism instead of working towards or abolishing racism? Are we still promoting racism, or we trying to abolish racism?
Excellent
question. And my question based on this. Now we had the KKK that have a past history when it comes to race in general, and we have the Black Panther or whatsoever. Now, if we associate the Trump appointee to the KKK, once more, instead of us embracing the KKK, even though they are not good, we consider them to be a bad group or whatsoever, why we can't at least find common ground for the two groups, for them to come together and explain to them the reason why we should be one people instead of them being divided. Because they're still going to be American, they're going to be white, and the black Panther is still going to be American, and they're going to be black. But if we ignore these two people, are we just promoting racism, or we trying to abolish racism?
That's a very good question. I don't have a quick and easy answer for it. I think it's best of all worlds that we find a way of sitting down and talking to each other and at least agreeing to disagree. That's the best of all worlds. Whether it's going to happen or not, I don't know. I'm hopeful as we move forward in time, as we're talking about just a moment ago, that slowly but surely as we improve as a nation, that we will overcome these differences in time. So I'm hopeful for that. Because we have a history of it. We are better off today in 2016 than certainly what my mother had to put up with in her day, what my grandparents had to put up as well. My children are growing up in a different environment now than what I grew up with. So I am hopeful that things will continue along that trajectory. So fingers crossed, and we will work hard to make this a better nation. So thank you everybody for your questions. Good night.
Thank you, Dr. Pagan.